Well, hello, I'm Jessica, and this is static site generators for documentation, or as listed, static site generators, what, why, and how, although it's actually going to be how, and how. You'll see. And you can actually follow along on your computer with these slides at slides.com/verythorough/SSG for static site generator -docs-mini, because this is the shortened 1-hour version of this workshop. So, moving on. A little bit about me. I am a documentation engineer at Netlify, which is an automation and deployment platform for front-end sites. We actually host a lot of documentation sites. If you're doing Dokusos code and you're making documentation with static site generators, it's an option to look into for building and deploying your sites. I'm also an instructor for Girl Develop It, which is a US organization, which I suppose could branch out into other places, but at the moment it only has about 45 chapters in the US teaching adult women, despite the name, low-cost coding workshops. So I teach workshops in Git and HTML and CSS, and soon also a static site generator workshop. I'm also a local co-organizer for the San Francisco Bay Area Write the Docs meetup. So if you are ever in the San Francisco area, ping me. I'm very thorough. I always do that. So I'm very thorough in Slack. And everyone says, oh, you are you? That's my username in Slack. So you can ping me and say, hey, I'm going to be in San Francisco. And maybe we can arrange to make sure that we have a meetup at the same time as you're in town. And so that's a little bit about me. I used to be a teacher for several years, and then I was a web developer for about 10 years. And now I do both of those things together. So moving on to the topics. What we're going to be covering. First, how we got here, as we look at web development through the ages, how we got to the point of using static site generators, how they work and why they're useful, how to choose a site generator, and you can see where we're getting to all the hows, how to make your own generated site, and then finally, how to keep learning after today. But we'll start with a little bit of history and looking at how we've made websites since the beginning of websites. Usually started out as simple static sites. The web was just a bunch of documents, and those documents were generally written in HTML. And so looking at this sample that I have here, it's a very, very simplified HTML page, which you wouldn't have actually seen that particular HTML element back in the day. But we have a nav tag, and in our nav we've got cats and dogs, and then we have an H1 tag, and we have cats as the title of this page, and maybe a P tag, and it's starting to talk about cats, and we have that markup in an HTML file. And then you would take that file and you'd put it onto a file server, which is basically just a folder on somebody else's computer. And accessing files on a file server is just like accessing files on your own computer, or just accessing, say, a server at your work. You're just grabbing that file. And so if we look at that, what that looks like in someone's browser, they are on the computer and they go to cats.html, and it sends a request to that file server and says, hey, give me cats.html. And the file server sends back that file that you made in HTML, and the browser translates it into an actual styled page. Pretty straightforward. The nice thing about that is that they are very simple, they're very fast, they're secure. Generally speaking, if you're just dealing with files, you're not looking at other vectors of access onto a site. This is pretty easy to work with as well. However, it was really repetitive to build. So for example, we had this cats.html page, and say you want to have your dogs.html page, and that whole nav and actually a whole bunch of other HTML that goes at the very beginning of all your pages, you'd have to copy and paste that from one file to the other. And I remember doing this. And then it got even better when you added birds.html, and now you have to add birds to every one of those menus on every other page. And that was no fun at all. And as programmers often do when they notice that they have to do something over and over again, it's time to make a computer do it. So that's where they started bringing in templates and databases to make the computer do that work of all that repetition. So instead of cats.html, you'd make a template that has, okay, this is pets, say, .php. It might have been in PHP. It could have been in a different language. That was a common one. Still is. And we'd change that up a little bit. And so we'd say, okay, here's our nav, but in this section of the nav, we're going to list all the pets so that when I add more pets to that list, I don't have to do it on every page. And then in our H1, we'll say, okay, the title for this one, and then the content will be the next section of it. So you've got this template where all of your pages are going to be made in the same way, and then you connect that to a database, which is just a table on somebody else's computer. And you'd take that content that was on each specific page, and you're putting it into the table, and you'd say, okay, here's an ID for each one, this is the title for each one, this is the content for each one. And you put those together, and now you can't put it onto a file server anymore. Now you're going to be putting it onto an application server. And this is something that's actually running code to put these things together in real time. So what that looks like is someone goes to the website and say they look for cats.php, or it might be cats.asp, or a variety of other ways of requesting it. And it sends that request to the application server. And the application server doesn't have anything to send back just yet. It has a little bit of work to do. So first thing, it goes and gets that template that you made, and then it goes to the database and queries it for the content that goes inside of that template. It gets the information that it needs, it fills it into the template, and builds it into an HTML page, and sends that HTML page back to your site, or back to the computer that requested it. So quite a few more steps in there, but the nice thing about it is that the computer's doing all the work and not you. So looking at the pros and cons of that, it's much quicker to build and change. I can add a page, and I can just say, hey, this is a bird page. I'm going to just add an entry into my database. And I can just say, here's birds, and they look like this, and they have this content. And then when somebody goes to request the birds page, it's going to build it for them right away. On the downside, loading that page is going to take longer because I'm not just serving up a pre-made file. I'm asking the server to go and build the file and then give it to the user. So it's doing that on the fly. It's also less secure because now you have an application server that's running code on the server, connecting to your database. People can send malicious code that gets onto your database and clears the whole thing, or all sorts of other fun things. And it also becomes more complex, and it also ties you, generally speaking, to a single server. It's harder to replicate that in different places around the world without caching and other complicated things. So that solved some things, but it presented some other problems of its own. Right around several years ago, people started to say, well, okay, doing all this work on the server is time-consuming. You have to go back over to the server. It has to do all the work and send it back to you. Well, what if we took this application server and we put it on the user's computer? The computer can run JavaScript. So what we're going to do is we're just going to load JavaScript to somebody's computer, and then it's got all the stuff that the server-side code would do. It's going to take that template, it's going to go and get to the server to get the data for the page, and it'll load the page for you, and going in between pages is going to be quicker because the parts that stay the same, the menu and things like that, don't have to get reloaded from the server every single time. Only the parts that change get reloaded. That part's quick and fast. The downside, though, is that so that part is the good part. It's less time between pages. But the downside is that that very first load time can be very, very slow because you're basically loading all of that server-side code onto somebody else's computer before they can even see anything. And I'm sure you've seen pages like that. In fact, the little gear icon reminds me of some blogger sites that I used to see, like that you'd go to a blogger site and it would have that little bee with the gears and it would work and work and work and work and then show you a page of text. And you're like, why did I wait that long for just a little bit of text? And so that was one of the downsides to it. It had some quick page loads in between. It can be really great for apps like Gmail was a big change over like Hotmail where, oh, all of a sudden I can load lots of things more quickly. But it's also more work for your client. So the speed of the computer that's running it also makes a bigger difference than it did before. So some improvements, some changes, but we've still got a lot of pros and cons to deal with here. And that's where static site generators come in. They kind of handle the best of both worlds in those things. And to talk a little bit how they work is they still let the computer do the work. They do that automation, but they do it in advance, not when the user comes to the site. So we've still got a template. This one might be in a pets.html file, but it's still got some templating language in there. It's not actually what the entirely HTML. It has some things in there to say, okay, in here, put all the things that go in the menu. In here, put the title for this particular page. And then it might take a file. So for example, in this one, inside pets folder, I'll have cats.md, which is a markdown file. And it has these little dashes at the top. They call it front matter. And says, OK, at the top of this file, I'm going to say the title of this is cats. And the layout I want to use is pets. And it's referring to that template. And then I have my content down below after those dashes. There's some conventions happening in that page. Or sometimes you might actually be using a database for the static site generator too. Or you might be using both in combination. But you're taking those two bits of information and you're putting them to a new kind of server. This one is a build server. And the nice thing about a build server is that it's doing all of these things at once. So I'll show you what that looks like. You've got your template, and you've got all of your files in your pets folder. You've got your dogs and your birds and your cats, and all of those are inside of this pet folder, and it's going to take both of those things together, put them into the build server, and the build server is going to go through each one of those and apply the template, and then generate a whole bunch of files. And that whole bunch of HTML files, that looks pretty familiar. That's something that you can stick into one of those file servers. So those are pre-built files. So you took away the automation, but you're doing it all at once, building a whole bunch of static files. So now those files can go onto a file server, which is more secure and faster. And you could also convert that file server to a really fancy CDN, which is a content delivery network, or a whole bunch of file servers connected across the globe, which particularly in Australia can be very useful if you are familiar with latency from loading things from, say, San Francisco. It's much better to be loading it from Sydney, for example. As a file server, because they're just files, you can do that. You can put them in different servers all around the world and have those accessible at the closest available point for your users, which you can't do as well with application servers. So looking at now, when someone goes to request that page again, it looks like it did before. It's now just a static site. It's just a bunch of files. So someone goes to request cats.html again, and the file server just gives that back. It doesn't have to do all those extra steps. It doesn't have to consult a database. It doesn't have to build the page on the fly. It just sends it right back. So does that all make sense to everybody? OK. So in many, many cases, this presents the best of both worlds. On the pro side, it's fast, it's secure, it can be scalable on a CDN, so you have a lot of things that you can do there. Also, one thing I didn't mention is hosting can be significantly cheaper. There are a lot of really good free hosting options out there for static files, and really not for application server hosting. Like, if you're using a free application server hosting, it's probably really sketchy. Another pro is that the computer is still doing that repetitive work. It's just not doing it when the user requests. It's doing it in advance. And then remembering that advantage of the between page loads and not having to go to the server when people put the application server onto the client and load it with JavaScript, you can still add that to a static site. So you can make a static site that builds all the static pages, and you can load those without JavaScript, but then add in JavaScript so that it'll load parts of the page so that you don't have to reload entire pages. It is possible to do that fancy stuff, and some static site generators are made to do this out of the box, and I'll get to that. One of the cons is that the ecosystem is not as mature yet. So the monolithic app of running application servers like Ruby on Rails or WordPress or so many other hosted CMSs is that they have all of these UIs and plugins and this entire ecosystem that has been around for a while, and people know how to use it, and there are handy tools you can use to build these sites without having to know how to code. And static site generators are not quite there yet in that area. There are many tools that are coming out, and I'll tell you about a couple. And it's definitely growing, but it's still kind of new. And I think that that's one of the areas that there's just not as much of an ecosystem yet for it. But I'm a bit biased, but I believe this is the direction where the web is going, and that ecosystem is only going to get bigger. So now that you know the history, let's look at some of the options for static site generators and things to keep in mind when you're choosing one for your own docs site or for another kind of site. So some things to think about. One of the very first ones are the preferred languages or tools of the developer. I think when you're handling docs as code, one of the really biggest benefits about doing it right now, especially because the tooling isn't in some ways as far along as more traditional ways of making docs, is that that's where the developers are. So the closer you are to the code, the closer you are to being able to have developer participation inside of the work that you're doing and things like that. And if you have someone else building your site, or if you are the one building your site, whoever the person is that's developing it, you might want to choose your site generator based on languages that you like to work with. So if you hate Ruby, don't pick Jekyll. So things to think about. That can be, depending on how much freedom you have and who's developing the site, that might be one of your first considerations, is what that person likes to even use in the first place. Another thing is ease of use. So the availability and quality of the docs can make a difference in whether you want to be using it. And there can be issues with complexity as far as the templating language. And I'll talk about different generators and how they measure up on both of those categories. Another thing to think about is content features. You could build all sorts of things custom if you wanted to, but many of these have built-in functionality for things like internationalization, handling different versions of your doc to match different versions of your software. There are things that might be built into the markup language itself, which I'll talk about. So that's another consideration. And then finally is speed. And the speed comes at the time to develop. So is it fairly easy to work with and to make changes to and things like that? To build, so that step where the build server takes your template and takes all your files and builds all those pages, that step can vary quite a bit between generators and how fast it works. So that's another thing to think about depending on the size of your site. And then to load, so how long it takes a page to load specifically from a site generator, or from the file that was built by the site generator, which theoretically could be the same, because theoretically you could build any kind of site you want, but out of the box, some are quicker than others because of some of those JavaScript features I talked about. So, keeping that in mind, we'll look at a few different, the most popular generators. So Jekyll is probably the most commonly known. So if someone says static site generator, and they've only heard of one, it's probably Jekyll. It's 10 years old now. It has lots of users, lots of examples, lots of content. So that is one thing that's really great about Jekyll, is that if you want to figure out how to do something in Jekyll, it's not too hard to find someone who already wrote a blog post about it, or find someone in the Write the Docs chat who already dealt with something like that.
Just
yeah.
as a data point, we weren't using Jekyll for our, a couple of companies ago, we weren't using Jekyll for our docs portal, but when I needed to set up an internal blog, I didn't pick it because we used Ruby or anything like that. I picked it because it was extremely feature-rich and extremely good at blogs, specifically like out of the box. So as the tech writer that just sort of dabbles in code but isn't really a coder, it's really easy for me to get it stood up. Not every static site generator is as easy out of the box as Jekyll is.
Yeah.
So that's something too. Like,
Yeah.
Pick things that your developers can handle, unless you think, oh, this is really good and I can handle it myself.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And so, yeah, what the developer prefers or what they like to work with, even if that means you are the developer. And yeah, and there are lots of examples and content out there, so that is one thing that's really helpful about it. It's built with Ruby, so if you're working with Ruby or you like that, that can be a plus for it. One thing that I have dealt with when I work with open source projects that have been in Jekyll, and people having different versions of Ruby on different computers, especially over different OSs, can be kind of frustrating. But generally speaking, that's just one more data point to know about. The templating language that's typically used in Jekyll is Liquid, that was created by Shopify. It's a fairly easy to read templating language. You can look at a Jekyll template, which we will do later, and you can basically read in English what it's doing. And so that's one thing that's particularly nice about Liquid templating, and not as nice about others that I'll get to. The content is written in Markdown, which is very well known, very popular with people working in open source and with developers in general. It was heavily adopted by GitHub. They automatically style files that are written in Markdown in their UI. And so anybody who's working on open source projects has written things in Markdown, and they all think, oh, this is a super easy Markdown language. Documentarians, you must love this, right? And, and then you go to a documentarian conference, and for example, Write the Doc Cincinnati had no less than 3 speakers have a slide dedicated to Markdown sucks. It's very, very easy. It is limited. It's very well known. It's very easy to use, but it doesn't have some of the features that other markup languages might have. But it's super widespread. And there are tools and features in each of these that can get around some of that. The configuration and data files are in YAML, which stands for yet another markup language, or did originally. They changed it recently to one backronym that now the Y stands for YAML. I hate those. It's fairly easy to read, but it's white space sensitive, which can be frustrating sometimes when you try to put in a setting and you're like, why isn't this working? And it's because you didn't tab it in enough. And so just to keep in mind, but it's really easy to read. It was, like Evan said, made for blogs, but it can be used for docs and more, and it has been. There are a number of docs projects that are made with Jekyll. And Jekyll has a showcase on the website that features some of those. And one of the things that is probably one of the primary reasons why people have started a site on Jekyll and then moved off of it eventually is because the builds can be slow. And if the site is very, very large, the builds can be very, very slow. And if you're making a lot of changes or you're working on it, then you have to wait for it to rebuild, and it can take minutes. Minutes is so long. So that's something to keep in mind. But one thing that is also nice about it is that it runs out of the box in GitHub Pages, which is another reason why Jekyll is one of the most popular and common ones, because it was made by one of the founders of GitHub, and it also runs automatically in GitHub Pages, which if you have the content of your site hosted in a GitHub repository, it can automatically build your Jekyll site for you. It does have limitations, though. If you need to use Jekyll plugins or things like that, generally speaking, you can't use those. And then also, there is a dedicated Jekyll channel in the Write the Doc Slack. So if you're using Jekyll, you can talk to other people who are using it and get answers about it. Another one that is almost as old, it's actually slightly older by a few months, is Sphinx. And at least in the docs community is one that's also very well known. Less so outside of docs, because as you can see, even in the logo, it's a Python documentation generator, not a static site generator. It's very focused on documentation, which is good in some ways because it is very focused on docs. But there's less content because it is more niche, but it is still quite popular for this particular use. It's built with Python, and there are some things built in for integrating it with Python code comments to take comments from the code and build those directly into your documentation. Another one of the benefits of running docs as code. It uses Jinja templating, which is a Python templating language. It's very similar to Liquid and also fairly easy to read. Now this one, in addition to supporting Markdown, it supports restructured text, which is one of the main reasons why the people who love Sphinx usually love it, is because of restructured text. It's more powerful than Markdown. It's less known, but it does have some features built into the language for setting terminology or things like that straight inside of the language, which usually the argument people make with that is that, okay, this is right inside of the language, so it's portable. The trouble is that there's not that many static site generators that use restructured texts, so it's only so portable. I actually only know of 2. So very often the argument is, well, if you're going to use includes and Jekyll or other things that are built into the static site generator to handle, like, I want a special formatting for this note or things like that, that you're locked into Jekyll then. Well, you're also kind of locked into Sphinx if you use restructured text. So something to keep in mind. One thing that's nice in Sphinx is they have a built-in versioning handling system in there. So if you can tag things for different versions of your software and it can build around that. It also does multiple output formats, including if you need to do it to PDF or LaTeX or EPUB. It does a variety of things in those lines. And it runs out of the box on Read the Docs. So Read the Docs is very associated with Write the Docs, and it's free and paid. There's different tiers of service, hosting service for documentation, and you can have your content in a Git repository and hook it up with Read the Docs, and they will host it for you for free and build it using Sphinx as the generator. There's also a dedicated Sphinx channel in Write the Docs Slack. Another one that has come in popularity in the last few years is Hugo. It's in very active development, which I would say the last two mostly active, but I would say this is more active development. One thing that's interesting about Hugo is it is built with Go, and I remember the first time I used it, I thought, oh, okay, now I've got to install Go on my machine so that I can run the Go. You don't actually need to do that with Hugo, and that is one of the things that's a nice benefit of it. It builds out directly to a Hugo binary, so you don't need to have Go, you don't need to worry about versions of Go, you can just run specifically the version of Hugo that you need to run. It's easy to download, it's easy to run. You can even handle it within your version control inside your repository itself. So that has been very nice for portability when you're working between multiple people who have to run it on their local machine. The Go template language, on the other hand, is interesting. If you've ever heard of a Polish calculator, it works like that. So a Polish calculator, instead of saying 5 plus 7, you say plus 5, 7. You say the operator, the function that you want to do, and then you say the arguments. And that's the way that Hugo or Go's templating works, where instead of saying, like in Liquid, you would say, if title equals home, do such and such. In Hugo, you would say EQ, which is a function meaning equals, title, home. And so that's a way of saying, like, okay, check if title equals home. And once you get used to that format, it makes more sense and it's not as difficult to deal with. But I do find that it has a steeper learning curve initially when you're looking at that sort of templating. It just doesn't read as well, and seeing that EQ or LT means less than, and that they're done as functions instead of sentences you can read is kind of frustrating. The content is in Markdown, and they have built-in shortcodes, which are ways of taking snippets of things and handling them in different ways. So one of those things that's locked into that particular generator, but kind of like restructured text is still locked in. So something to think about. Hugo is made to be more general purpose, but there are docs themes for it, and some of them quite good. It's also made to be very flexible and extendable, and becoming more so all the time, which also makes it somewhat complex. You can handle different sorts of contexts, different ways of handling the taxonomy of your content, but that can also make it very complex, which means that you need to rely on their docs some more, which can be extensive but also hard to read. There are a lot of docs inside of the Hugo docs where it'll just go to the page and it'll say, you can do this thing. And then it just stops. And you're like, an example, something? No, okay, there's the thing. I'll just test and figure out, okay. So they're hit or miss. They do have built into the language or into the generator dynamic menus and tables of contents. So there are things that you can use within the templates that'll automatically generate those things from files that you can set up. It also has a reputation for very fast builds. Many of those Jekyll refugees who said, oh, my build is way too slow, they moved to Hugo because it has a reputation for being much faster. Go is a concurrent language. It can do a lot of different things at once, and it just builds a lot faster.
Some of it that can be important too. If you're doing you're doing a lot of local edits and you're previewing locally on your machine, you want a fast feedback loop. So if every time you like type a word, change a word or change some sort of visual style thing, and you gotta wait 5 minutes for it to finish building so you can see what it looks like before you push up, that's a real pain.
Yeah, someone asked me before, they're like, well, who cares about the build time? Like, some things out, but when you're working locally is one of the places where it's most painful is maybe you're working locally and you just want to change a few things and you just want to see, okay, what did that look like? And in Hugo, it'll take a few seconds. In Jekyll, you might have to like go get a cup of coffee. And so it makes a difference. Another thing, with Hugo, they have an active support forum, so that can be a good place to find out information. And there is a Hugo channel in the Write the Docs Slack. Gatsby is a new one that has recently come out. It's a few years old now. It's very active development, very active documentation development too. They are now a venture-funded company, so they have actual money behind making this open source project happen. I suppose there's also, when there's money behind it, always a risk that at some point they're going to just close source it. Something similar happened to Gitbook. But, you know, people around it are like, no, that's never going to happen. But it's early days, so you never know. It is made to be a general purpose site builder, but it is becoming popular for some documentation. One of the big differences here is that it's built with JavaScript. Specifically, it's using the React framework, which is very, very popular with people who write JavaScript. And that has some benefits and downsides. The templating is made in React components, which, if you're familiar with JavaScript and particularly with React, is something that you can hop in and go, this is amazing, I already do this sort of thing, it's gonna work exactly the same as all my other work that I do, I don't have to learn anything new. But if you don't know JavaScript or React, I find it harder to read and has a steeper learning curve than some of the basic templating where you've got an HTML page and you just put in some variables. So that's kind of, it depends on what kind of background you're coming from for this. The content can be in Markdown or in MDX, which is a combination of JavaScript and Markdown that can be powerful, but again, is JavaScript heavy. One of the things that is a big benefit is that this has that sort of static single page app hybrid structure. So that thing where I said you can put the application server onto the user's computer because in between page loads can be very fast. Out of the box, Gatsby does that. So any single Gatsby page with no JavaScript at all will load. And you can just load that right up. You don't need to wait for the JavaScript to load. You don't need to have JavaScript on at all. You can see any page in a Gatsby site out of the box. But then in the background, it loads the JavaScript and it loads the other pages you might go to so that when you click on a link to go to another page, it goes there very quickly because it's already got that stuff loaded in the background. You could do this with any site by writing your own JavaScript to make it do all those things, but one of the nice things about Gatsby is that it happens out of the box. It also has lots of plugins for customization. That's generally how they work. Those are still very code-heavy plugins. It's not like if you're using WordPress and you just install a plugin by clicking a button and putting some settings into a UI. But plugins are typically how they handle customization of the generator. And there's a pretty popular, pretty robust ecosystem of plugins developing for it too, because React is popular and people like making new things in React. They have a Discord server, which Discord is kind of like Slack, but made for gamers and has voice chat. But they use that for community and chat and support because you can have unlimited messages for free, unlike free Slack. They do not have a Gatsby channel in Write the Docs Slack, but there is a static site generators channel. Dokusos is another one that's built with React. It's fairly new. I think it's still less than a year old, maybe slightly more than that. Just over, yeah. It was built by Facebook. It's made for docs specifically. It has a simple built-in theme with menus, versioning, internationalization, and search. So if you wanted to just make a quick doc site out of the box and it's got a bunch of things built into it, it's already got that. And if you don't want to do a lot of customization, you can have a fairly straightforward doc site out of that. The docs for it are fairly short, but the product, like I said, is fairly simple. It's not trying to do a whole lot of things. It's very specific. The content is in Markdown. And like Gatsby, it's built with JavaScript and React. Facebook also made React, so it kind of makes sense that they use that in their docs generator. So it has some of the same benefits in that it has that fast-loading static single-page app, that's what SPA stands for, hybrid structure, and it also has the templating that's in React. So it's got those same pluses and minuses. But if you're just doing an out-of-the-box docs site and you don't need to do a bunch of customization, the downsides of the templating might not be such an issue for you. And then finally, we have ViewPress, another JavaScript one. It's the newest of them all, less than a year old. Again, this one is made for docs, again with a built-in theme. And this one is built with Vue, which is like the new up-and-coming competitor to React, another JavaScript framework, gaining a lot of popularity. And so if you're working with someone who really likes to use Vue, they might want to use this instead of, that React one. And the content, again, is written in Markdown, but they also have some docs-focused extensions added onto it and the ability to use Vue inside of Markdown, kind of the way that there's MDX for Gatsby. One thing that I thought was kind of a handy feature is it has a built-in last updated functionality. So based on when you change the file and it gets committed into Git, it will automatically display the time that page was updated. You can write code to make that happen yourself, but it's nice that this happens out of the box. And just like the last two, it has some of the similar benefits and challenges of other JavaScript-based generators, that the templating can be a little bit more weird if you're not used to JavaScript, but it does have that built-in fast loading between pages. Now, one thing I should say is going back to one of the Hugo creators said, any static site generator can do that same JavaScript loading, which is true. You just have to write it yourself. The JavaScript ones that were the last three, it's built in, but you could add that sort of in-page loading to any of the other ones. And you may find a theme that already has that built in as well. So that was a few. There are actually over 400 static site generators on staticgen.com, and that's a link. So you could look at more if you really wanted to consider lots more options, but I think that kind of got you started. So now,
sorry, I was just
yes.
going to say, when you're looking at that list, I would definitely suggest piloting a bunch before you settle on one. There will be some right at the top that you think, oh, let's go with the most popular one. But it may not be right for you or your organization, so I would definitely pilot a couple before you settle.
Yeah, and all of the ones that I just talked about, some of those are not that close to the top, in particular the ones that are doc-specific. So Sphinx, Dokusos, ViewPress, they're close to the top, but they're not as high as some others because they're more specific. So they're just not going to have as many users. And the popularity is entirely based on GitHub stars. So you basically click the like button on a repository. That's what gets them to the top of the list. So, but again, some of those considerations that I talked about on that first slide would be what you'd want to keep in mind when you're choosing one for yourself. But now we're going to take that and apply that and build a site of your own. I have a very simple sample repository. And I'm going to open this in a new tab so you can see that. Oops, I'll open it twice. So if you're following along on the slides, there's this button to deploy to Netlify, which I'm doing it on this because it happens to be a very quick and easy way to have it all set up. Normally in a longer workshop, you would actually be running this locally on your machine and then pushing it up later, but I'm not going to teach you Git today, and I'm not going to teach you how to run Ruby on your machine and deal with any of those things. So we're going to be editing inside the browser, and you can load this up to your site. So what this would do when you click that button is it connects your GitHub account. If you don't have one, you can create one. And if you would prefer to use GitLab, and you're familiar with their UI, because I'm not going to be using that as an example in the slides, you can also choose that as an option instead. And what it will do is clone my sample repo to your account, and then set the build settings automatically and build your site to an address for your site. And I'll show you that right now. So I'm connecting to my account. Our Wi-Fi's a little slow. I already have one called Jekyll Basic Blog, so I'm going to have to call my repo something new. You can just leave yours the way it is.
Quite a few browser analysts there.
Wow.
Yeah, I do. That's not even quite all of them. Some of them, because you run out of room to put addresses into the URL bar. So, anyway, so now my site is being built, and I can click over to the Deploys tab, and you can see that it's building, and it runs a log of this. This is a Jekyll site, which you could build automatically on GitHub Pages. Although one of the nice things is that you get a log of what's happening, and so if it fails, you have something to look at. If it fails on GitHub Pages, you have no idea why it failed. And now it says site is live, and I can go up there. I'm going to go back here. And there's my very, very exciting site. I made this site super simple, so it's not too complicated to look at the code and understand what's going on there. And it's got this funky random address. You can change that if you want to. But you have a chance to see what the site looks like. So I've got this index page and a couple of blog posts. This one is not a portfolio site. I should have changed that in description because I made this simpler for this short workshop. And there's one post in here that's a Markdown sample. If you're not familiar with Markdown, this has an example of all sorts of things formatted in Markdown, and then you can look at the source code for it to see how it was made. And, oops, I should have. I know! We got this home button here at the top, part of my template. Could have used that. So then I have my first post, which just has a little bit of information and a picture of my dogs, just because, why not? Which happens to be them dressed up as Plants vs. Zombies for my nephew's birthday party. Yeah, Monty on the left there, he's kind of cute for a zombie, but, he's got the costume. And so you can see there's not much to this site. But now what we can do, and you can find this from where your Netlify site is, where it says deploys from GitHub. And you can use that to open up the repository where your site is. And we're going to just look through some of the code in this. And because this is a very simple site, it doesn't have a whole lot of code in it. And what I'm going to do is I want to see how a post is made. So let's look at, well, where might I find some posts? We've got this posts folder. That kind of seems like where I might find posts. And inside here, I've got things that correspond to the titles of my posts. I have this thing that says myfirstpost.md in it and markdown sample.md, which looks an awful lot like what I had in my site. And I'll also notice that at the beginning of this is a convention that's in Jekyll for posts specifically, is that they start it with the date. The name of the file is year, and then month, and then day, and then the title of the post. Which one thing that's handy about that is it means that automatically inside the folder where your files are, they're all in date order. And so when you want to look at recent posts, they're going to be right there. And rather than if they were alphabetical or something. You can also save other kinds of content. They don't have to have date at the top, at the beginning of them. Posts is particularly special in Jekyll. So you start the file name with the date, and then the name of it, and then .md. And now we can see, I clicked on one of the files to see what it looks like inside. Now this is a Markdown file, so GitHub has formatted it so that it turns it into some pretty HTML. And I don't want to look at that. I want to look at the raw view of it. You can click on this little pencil or raw, but I'm going to click on the pencil because that's for changing it. So now, let me zoom in a little bit. Now we got some information that looks like that little drawing that I made before. And it's got that dash, dash, dash at the top and has layout post and title, my first post. So that's some information about the content. And then below that, it has content that looks like what was inside of the post itself. So I've got the title, and then I've got the information that I had put inside the file. I got this welcome to my brand new blog, what this is for, and some information. Oh, the shift key on this Apple keyboard. So I can make a change into this file, and the reason we're doing this in the GitHub web is so you don't have to install everything on your computer, but we can save this inside of the GitHub web UI. And so I can go in here, I can make a change, and I'm going to say commit this directly to the master branch, which means that it's going to save that change directly to the main branch of my site. And when I commit that, normally when you're using a static site generator, you might build it all on your own site and then push up the files, but it really works at its best when you're connected to some sort of continuous integration. So you could use a tool like CircleCI or Travis or Jenkins or something like that, or you could use Netlify is another one you could use. GitLab's got that some of the CI built into it too. And if I go back to my deploys now, when I made a commit, oops. It started doing a new build. And because this is a very small, simple site, the build went really fast. So you're not going to see the Jekyll slowness on this tiny site. But that build, and so now when I go to my site and I refresh the page, it's got that new line that I added. And anyone visiting the site will see that new page. So looking at that, we found that there's the layout. So this is the content of it, but that's not HTML. We still don't know how it's building the HTML page. We don't know where it got that home button at the top. So we also have this clue, though, in here, which is that the layout is post. So maybe let's see if we can find that post layout in the repository. So I'm going to go back up to the root of the repository, which you can do by clicking the name of it up there at the top. And let's see, let's look around. Oh, well, I've got a folder called Layouts. This is one of the things that's nice about Jekyll, is it kind of fits with what you'd expect. So inside the Layouts one, and I've got a post.html that is the post layout. So let's look inside of that one. I think I can make it a little bit bigger. And this is where you can see some examples of the liquid templating inside of Jekyll. And so we've got some HTML in here. And so at the top of every single post page, I'm going to say this is the body and there's the header. It's got this thing at the top that says include header.html. I'm going to come back to that in a second. But after the header, this navigation that's going to be at the beginning of every page, and you could have something that lists all of the different posts in your header, but in this particular case, that wouldn't make much sense. But you could do it with pages. Then down in the main section, it says page.title. That is going to put inside that H1 the title field from your Markdown file. So whatever you had set as the title, that's what it's going to put into there. And then content is going to correspond to anything after that second dash, dash, dash. All of the content that goes in the bottom part of the Markdown file, that will be rendered into HTML and put into your file. And then once the content's done, it's going to do the end of the page. It has a footer that has the post date. This is another thing that's built into Liquid. They use this little pipe character to do filters. So it's saying, take the page date, which in this particular case, it's getting that date from the file name. And then it's going to pipe it to a special Liquid function that turns the date to a string. So it's using an encoded date format. And then it's going to turn it into a string. And there are different things you can add to that function to say, I want the date to look like this, so that it has the day first, and then the month as an abbreviation, and then the year as 2 digits. And so that's another thing that is relatively straightforward inside of Liquid templating. And so we kind of see how that template works, and that's one of the nice things about Liquid. Does that all make sense? Whoa. Now, I'm going to get back to this include here, and let's go back to the base of the repository again. And look at that, we've got a folder called includes. And here's header.html. And so if I includes are something that you can make snippets of code to use anywhere inside of your site. You can use it down inside of the content. You can use it in your templates. That's where Jekyll gets some of that added templating ability when you don't want to just say like, oh, put this string in here. Well, you want something that's a little bit more than just a string that's a title or something like that. So every single one of my pages, I want to have this same header at the top. I'm going to have the doc type HTML at the top of each one of my pages. I'm going to have some information that goes in the head about the CSS and where the fav icon is and things like that. I don't want to have to make those in each one of my templates, so I make it as an include and put that include into the templates for the different kinds of pages. So includes are handy things that you can include in a variety of places. And this include also has a nice example of a longer format in liquid templating, which this one has a conditional. So unlike Hugo, it's a little bit easier to read. So I can say if page.title equals home. So I think you kind of get what it's saying. If the name of the page is home, do this. So this happens to be within the title tag. The title tag is what shows inside of the tab at the top of your page. So if it's the home page, say the site title and the site description. Otherwise, if it's not the home page, say the page title and then the site title. So you can put conditional things inside of your templating. You can also do loops, which I didn't put in here. But where's the site title information? We didn't get anything about that. So maybe let's try and search to see if we can find where these things are. That's another thing you can do inside of your repository, either locally or I use this a lot when I'm going to find out where somebody did something. And I think description is probably the least common word. If I do title, I'm going to find that in all the posts and stuff too. So if I search for description. All right, so we got a couple of things. I've got that includes header. I already was there, so that's not going to help me very much. But I can also look at config.yaml file. I mentioned YAML as a type of format for configuration. Every Jekyll site has a config.yaml file that sets a variety of things. You can decide on plugins in here. You can do a bunch of settings. The very, very basic settings in here are that I set the site title and the site description. So anywhere in the site, I can refer to site.title or site.description, and it'll put that information into the page at that spot. I could have site.unicorn, and any place that if I said unicorn equals rainbows, then, or I guess it'd be : rainbows, then anywhere I said site.unicorn, it's going to put rainbows in there. The word probably, or emojis, I don't know. So that's kind of how all those different pieces work together. And another thing that is key to a Jekyll site is the gem file and the gem file lock, which is a Ruby thing. If you're running locally or you're running in a build tool, that says what the dependencies are. It's really basic in this one. It just says use Jekyll. But you can add other things in there. And that keeps track so that everybody's using the same versions of things. I'm not going to get into the details of that. And so those are all the different parts to it. You can poke around. You can change. You can add a new post if you just use the same format as before, year, month, day, and the title. You can change a post, and when you save it, it'll automatically rebuild. You can also change your templates. And then another thing that can be fun is you can go into style.css, which is where all of the different styles of the blog, as lovely as they are set. So you could change the color of your text, or you can change some other information about it, change what the font looks like, all those sorts of things inside of here. So it's basically a very, very simple site that you can try playing around with. And if you have questions about it, I can help answer those. But what I'm going to do now is go back to my slides. Oh, I don't know the full. We're just going to do it with the tabs. And give you a few more resources of where you can go next. So one thing you can do is clone that repository, and you can look up in the docs how to clone your repository, bring that down locally, and then you have to learn how to have Ruby and build it locally, but there's a link to directions for how to do that in both of those things. You can also try another Jekyll starter. So that one's super basic. Skinny Bones is another basic site that's a little bit fancier. So here's a little demo of it. You can see it's got a lot more stylish things going on. It's got some other layouts and things like that. So it's a little bit more complex if you want to get a little bit fancier. Tom Johnson, who writes the I'd Rather Be Writing blog, has a Jekyll documentation theme, which is another site built in Jekyll, and you can clone that repository and make a docs site that has a bunch of docs features in it built with Jekyll. Then you can try other generators. On staticgen.com, which I linked back before, there are buttons to automatically deploy different ones, or you can try running it locally, try a bunch of different ways to look at how it's built, how it works, look at the features. And then another thing that you can do is looking at managing content with a headless CMS, which is out of the scope of this, but very often you want to be working with the content without having to know how to use Git and how to run that locally and all of those sorts of things. And headless CMSs are a category of managers for that content that they don't build the site, they just manage the content itself. So CMSs traditionally have built the whole site as well as managed the content for it. And the video that I have in the next line, watch a video about the evolution of the CMS, is another talk that I did about how that sort of has changed over time and how those things compare. But headless CMS has a comparison of a variety of different ones. Many of them are Git-based. So Netlify CMS is an open source project that we've made that is a wrapper for Git functions. So it basically is doing all the Git stuff in the back end. Someone else who wants to work with Git can do Git functions with it at the same time. On the user's end using Netlify CMS, you just have a UI instead. So instead of having to write those front matter fields and know, like, was that capitalized, or is there an underscore, or is it camel cased, you just have a widget and you just put in the information and then it automatically saves it into the format that you're looking for. But there are other ones that are API based, and there are ones that are proprietary and ones that are open source. There's a variety of options. So that's another thing to look into when you're looking deeper into those. And if you have any questions about it, you can find me on Twitter or in Slack with the username Very Thorough. And feel free to ask those anytime. And I think at this point, we only have like 2 minutes left. If you want to poke around, and I can go and answer any questions individually as you're looking at things, or if you have other more general questions. But otherwise, thank you. So.